Welcome to the MSDW Podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor of MSDynamicsWorld.com. This week, I speak with the authors of the popular Dynamics GP Land blog. It's written by two Microstaff MVPs, Christina Phillips and Steve Endow. We talk about their experiences maintaining a blog over almost a decade, the kind of work they do with Dynamics GP these days, what they've learned about Dynamics 365 for financials, and what cloud ERP projects mean for investing in successful software solutions. So let's go. Okay, so Christina, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Happy to be here.
So I thought maybe I could start by getting a little bit of history from the two of you on the blog that you co-author or both contribute to, Dynamics GP Land. It's been around for several years now, and I've always really enjoyed checking in on it and seeing what both of you are writing about for your readers. It's one of the better known GP blogs, and I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of how you got involved writing it and sort of what it means to you as a place where you both clearly spend some of your time. So Steve, do you want to start?
Well, actually, I'll give Christina credit for starting the blog. I was just trying to look up what year it was started. Do you happen to remember, Christina? It was quite a while ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, 2006, 2007, something in that neighborhood?
Yeah, I'm actually checking the dates now. 2008, September 2008. Oh, okay. So 9 years ago.
All right. That's scary.
Do you remember what made you both want to start it?
So I started it because, and Steve can attest, back then, I wanted to be an MVP. And I was like, what do you have to do to be an MVP? And so I decided that, as I sometimes get these wild ideas, I had decided that I was going to start a blog. And the funny part is there was actually supposed to be 3 people involved in the blog, which was me, Steve, and Lauren Zimke, formerly of Winsoft, currently of E1, I think. And we all talked about it over email, and I set it up. And then Lauren did not contribute anything for like a year, maybe 2 years, but we kept him on the little description until finally, I think Steve was like, maybe we should revise that. And I was like, yeah, sure.
Not to bash Lauren, though. He's a busy guy, so.
No, not at all. He had a lot going on. So.
Yeah.
But it was fun to tease him about it. Still tease him about it to this day. So.
And actually, that was a joke when Christina first started it. We had discussed the concept of MVP, and we looked at people like Mark Polino and Mariano Gomez, and we asked, how in the world do they do this? They obviously work, and then they blog, and then they attend conferences and speak and do these sessions and training, and we assumed they just didn't sleep. And now we're here, and we're kind of understanding what that's like, and it is a very busy workday. Let's put it that way.
I mean, I have to think you must be getting something out of it to continue doing it. I imagine, since you guys both do a really good job of sort of documenting things that you're dealing with in your, what I assume is the rest of your day or the rest of your hours spent in your roles. Is it useful for you to sort of as a place to sort of document the challenges you faced and sort of journal them for your own usage?
I think at least for me, it started out of a shift in the community. So at the time when we started the blog was right at the end of, Tech Conference had gone away as a opportunity for partners to come together, especially consulting side, not necessarily sales side. And so Steve and I had been involved with some different efforts, way back even before there was much partner involvement in GPUG. Steve and I were involved in some efforts amongst other partners to kind of collaborate on learning and kind of share. We even staged our own little mini conference one year in Orange County and went out there with a couple different consulting partners that we knew and sat around and debriefed each other on different things that we knew as the technology was changing. And the blog, for me, seemed like a good platform to kind of further encourage that kind of collaborative community, because although we, in some ways, compete, right, for deals and for customers, at the end of the day, I think Steve and I both know a lot of people in the channel, and they don't feel like competition, and we don't, we collaborate a lot with other partners, and I like that. I like that part of my job, and I like being challenged by people like Steve or Lauren or other people that I've come across in my career that are doing cool things.
And for me, I guess at the time, I may not have thought through what the blog meant and how it would grow and what it would mean several years down the line. But at the time, I think there were a couple things. One, it was just an opportunity to share. So if we can write some articles, share them with the community, that kind of helps everyone. And then one thing I noticed while doing it is it really makes you think. So you'll notice an issue, you'll start writing about it, and then that leads to a little bit more research, and you learn as part of that process, and you document that. And so you come away having learned something. And then the third thing is kind of a joke that many bloggers have is years later, they'll Google some error in Dynamics GP, and they'll find their own blog post from 4 years ago, and it'll have a full description and the solution to the problem. And we will have no recollection of writing the blog post. And so it's kind of funny. It serves as this knowledge base of our own that we use, and it comes up via Google and it helps us solve our own problems years later.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Yeah, and I'll have coworkers forward it to me, and they'll say, "Look what I found when I was looking for it." And I'll be like, "Yeah, I vaguely recall that." Yep. I think one of the challenges for me that I've talked to Steve about is as my career has changed, because I'm on a distinctly different path than Steve in terms of kind of what I focus on today versus what I was doing 10, 11 years ago. And that's been challenging for me in finding the relevance in the blog, right? Because I don't spend as much time with like tough functional or technical problems as I did even 5 years ago. And so it's been interesting to me to kind of think through how to be relevant and how to say something that's worth saying that people might find interesting or even disagree with, because I think any kind of conversation is good when we talk about the software, but also about the process and the reality while living every day.
And I have the same issue. I often, as you probably seen in my blog posts and Twitter posts, I often deal with development-related issues and topics. So deep API development with .NET, and it's often I'll go weeks without really digging into GP. And so sometimes it's hard to find GP relevant content. And so it is a challenge. But having done the blog for several years, you tend to just be on the lookout for those opportunities. So maybe some window was modified with a new release. Maybe you ran into an error. A customer encountered some situation. And so we're just now in the practice of saying, oh, okay, let's write a blog post about that.
Okay, yeah, and that was one of my questions, because I think one of the things you guys both do really well compared to a lot of other bloggers in this space is you're able to sort of shape stories in a way that makes it interesting and engaging. And I wanted to find out if you think you're just getting more interesting cases than maybe the average GP consultant or firm, or do you just think you have an eye for sort of spotting some of those things and documenting them? Steve, it sounds like you're saying that you maybe are on the lookout and kind of paying careful attention so you can write some of this down.
Well, for me, some of the most interesting posts come out of the bizarre scenarios that I just happen to encounter. And I don't know if it's I work with those more or just coincidence, but I run into some really unusual client situations, and I'm thinking, this is odd, but this can't be the only customer that has this issue. And so when we work through it, and it's a lot of it's surprising content, like how come GP doesn't handle the data this way? Or why is this customer having this very complex process? And how do we solve that? And so some really interesting situations come up, and it's like, I think it's interesting. So I like to write about it.
I like to think that we're just exceedingly witty and intelligent, right, Steve?
Well, that's a given, I think.
I do think that was one of the things, I mean, some history on Steve and I, and, Lauren is kind of the third absent party. I mean, we met on a project over 10 years ago that was the kind of project that would have been set up for us to hate each other. And instead, I think we all kind of clicked around at times just the nonsensical and rabbit hole nature of what we do. And I still tell the story about how Steve, under pressure to depreciate, 500,000 assets in less than a week time, Steve reverse engineered the depreciation process in GP, figured out how to do it all in the back end. And I I still bring that up in conversation because I think we were all kind of just fascinated by, can it be done? And how can we do it? And, it was kind of fun. It's not very often in the GP world that you do get to work hand in hand with another consultant for, in our case, weeks, months, years on end on a project. Most of our projects aren't that big, but that time period, I think, kind of, even when we would disagree and argue over the best way to approach something, I think there's always been some mutual appreciation for the curiosity, and then also just the reality of what we do, and how some days it's a lot of fun and some days it makes you want to pull your hair out.
Yeah, that sounds like it could be, one of those, a description of a lot of jobs. Maybe the interesting parts are there's enough of those interesting parts to keep you both in it over all these years, huh?
There are situations that I've encountered frequently where you would think that other customers have encountered this and this problem's been solved. But when you dig into it, you find some pretty difficult challenge that say GP just doesn't handle, like the 500,000 assets that you need to depreciate over 10 years to bring a customer's migrated data up to the current date. And you'll encounter people who say that can't be done. And they just say, well, it's not an option in the software, so you can't do it. And we tend to look at each other and say, well, let's think about that. And we know SQL, we know some of the development, and we put all the tools and skills together. And oftentimes you can come up with a really creative solution if you put your mind to it. And in that particular case, we really had no choice. To run GP depreciation, I think we had estimated would take like 3 weeks of continuous processing. It was absurd. So the customer would be unable to go live with accurate financials in that scenario. So we had to come up with an alternative. And, with enough time and elbow grease, we came up with something that miraculously worked in a few hours.
Now, Christina mentioned that it was a project that, if I understood you correctly, was sort of set up for the three of you to hate each other or to go to war with each other. What did you mean by that? Was it something about the challenge of it, or was it the way the project was structured?
Do you want to take this one?
So it was a situation where we had multiple consulting firms involved in a single project, and the client itself had engaged independent business consultants as well that were managing the project. So you had a lot of people and a lot of competing interests. Sometimes Steve and I would joke because we'd look around the room and we would see, $1,800 billing an hour in the room. And I know, Steve and I both coming from the GP world, that was just not how those projects were done. And I think, Steve at the time worked for a partner there, and there could have been some resentment about why I was in the mix. And then Lauren Zimke was there as a developer for Winsoft. And, I think luckily for the client, I feel, and luckily for all of us, we all kind of clicked on that project. And I know I learned a ton. Like it broadened my horizons in a way that I attribute a lot of my career afterwards to, both the project and working so closely with Steve and Lauren.
Yeah, it was an intense, very long, complex project involving GP, Winsoft, lots of moving pieces. It was a relatively large client, and we effectively had 4 different consulting firms in one conference room over the period of many months to implement the software. So it was very complex and challenging, and definitely some project management issues that we had to deal with on our end, but it was good.
Was it a large scale system that was being deployed by GP standards? It sounds, like you said, it sounds like a far bigger team than you typically hear about. Yeah,
it was about 30 GP users, but probably a dozen plus Winsoft users, and they had a service. They needed service management to manage several 100,000 assets across the western half of the United States. So a customer calls, says, I need this appliance serviced, and so they dispatch a technician. All those calls had to be tracked. We Wensoft actually had to develop new route management techniques in order to best route the service person throughout the day. So moderately complex, and that involved messaging between GP and Wensoft. And then on the GP side, we had to manage those assets, deal with all the transactions relating to procurement, inventory management for all the parts and servicing. So a lot of moving pieces, quite a few people involved. And then, as Christina mentioned, we had a project management team who were not GP partners or experts, and they were directing us on the GP side, and I was a consultant on the GP side. Christina was brought in to do training. Wensoft had a couple of consultants there, and so it was a pretty complex process in terms of my experience with GP projects.
Right.
Well, and I think that, they were also coming off of a massive in-house maintained AS400, I think. It was AS400, right?
Yeah,
and they had developers in-house, and so And I think it was also my first encounter, and these don't happen very often, where the client really pulled out all the stops in terms of, we were there for weeks on end. The money piece of it was not in the forefront. Like for them, I think getting the system they wanted and the way they wanted it was at the forefront. And that was freeing in a lot of ways. But it also created, that from a project management perspective, it created a scope nightmare, right? Because anything that's asked for suddenly becomes part of what is needed.
Yes.
So.
And coming from the AS400 system, which was fully custom, they would say, well, we need this screen and these fields to behave in this manner, and their developer would customize the window. And so migrating over to GP, they thought, well, we need to highly customize this window. And it got to the point by the end of the project where they had a highly customized implementation that they were afraid to upgrade. And so that was mandated by the project managers. And so that was part of what we commiserated about, that when you radically customize an off-the-shelf solution, you start to lose some of the benefits of that solution, and upgrades become something really scary and high risk, rather than something where now, out of the box or vanilla GP implementation, you just run the upgrade and it usually goes pretty smoothly.
Do you have any idea what happened to that particular company, or if they're still using GP or not?
I don't know if they ever upgrade. I know they were actually featured in a Microsoft promotional video, I believe, so given their size. But I think they've changed partners at least twice since we were there, and I don't know where they're at in terms of the current version or upgrades.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations that Steve and I have had over the years that we kind of perpetually come back to is kind of consulting responsibility in terms of how you set a customer up for future success. And I think that was something we talked a lot about there, and felt very conflicted about, to be perfectly frank, because it's like you want someone to be able to continually return and build on their investment, right? And I think that plays heavily into how development is approached, how scope is controlled, how kind of not just thinking about today, but thinking about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what are these choices going to mean? And I don't think customers always think about that, right? They think in the immediate term of, well, I needed to work this way or I wanted to work that way, because they want to avoid the pain of change, right? But a lot of times I think you're just pushing that pain down the road. You're not necessarily avoiding it.
Coming out, I'm just thinking out loud here, but coming from an AS400 system, might that have been their first, their first large-scale ERP in this organization, and perhaps they weren't? Because I would think at this point in time, almost any company that's a mature company that's been around 20 years and has probably gone through several ERPs and would probably be thinking of that at this point. Or maybe the software vendors today kind of almost enforce it a little bit more than they would have 10 years ago.
That's a good question. And I think the distinction is that their AS400 system was their operation system. So it managed their service management, their asset tracking, all aspects of their core business. And I believe they used JD Edwards for their financials, but that only played a certain role within their overall business. And the migration to Dynamics GP and Wensoft was to transition all of their business over to this one supposedly integrated platform. And so it was a significant transition. And in my experience, when you involve the operational systems, which often are separate from ERP, it dramatically increases the complexity of the product, as the operations, in my experience, are often much more complex than the financial aspect of the ERP system.
Well, and that's maybe a jumping off point to another topic I wanted to get your input on. I've noticed several posts recently that you've written about upgrades in GP, and I wanted to just kind of get a sense from you of where things are changing in the GP landscape as it relates to upgrades today. With the most recent GP release or last couple of releases, are those new releases really changing the way clients are approaching the upgrade process for the product? Is it changing their likelihood to upgrade, or the way they're planning for it? And Steve, maybe start with you.
Well, my observation is that, I forget when, a few years ago, Microsoft decided to increase the frequency of the Dynamics GP releases. And at some point they went to the R model rather than just the service pack model. And it kind of changes the psychology around the releases. Instead of a service pack, like we're fixing bugs, the R releases, I believe, are intended to convey it's a new mini version release, or an interim version release that includes new functionality. And so they tried that for a while, but I think they found, based on what I heard at the conferences, that they were actually moving too fast. And so the pace of their releases was too fast for clients to adopt. And so then they scaled it back, and I forget where they're at now. I think it's maybe one release per year, something to that effect. And I think that may be more manageable. Several years ago, it used to be that GP customers would stay on a version for 3 to 4 more years. And now Microsoft is pushing new releases annually. It's a big shift for customers. And I think that's taking them time to adapt to. But on the other hand, Christina, let me know what your experience has been. But in general, my experience has been that GP upgrades tend to go smoother nowadays. I interact with many partners now who just do in-place upgrades. They don't do the test upgrade environment and an initial, a test run of the upgrade process. They just say, okay, on Friday, we're going to do the upgrade, and they upgrade the production servers, and they just make sure to have backups, and it usually goes well. Maybe a few minor issues they encounter, but in general, I'm seeing that as the trend for the in-place upgrade. So it seems the upgrade process is less traumatic, goes smoother. Microsoft has really refined that process.
I would agree. I mean, we do test upgrades, I think, when somebody is new to us or has a complicated environment with lots of customization and different things like that, or if they've gotten behind and they're making multiple jumps, right, from an upgrade perspective. But I think the vast majority of ours are in place, and to be honest, the vast majority of ours are remote, so completely hands off. They just happen.
Yeah, good point.
But I also think, and I don't know that this was a rationale on Microsoft's side, but I know from a consulting side, the thing about the slower release schedule is that I think it gets the services cost for the software back in line where it needs to be. I think one of the biggest problems with the quicker release was the consulting cost. I mean, that is one thing that really hasn't changed over the years. Is I don't really feel like we've got a higher proportion of IT doing their own upgrades. It's about the same, I think, as it was 10 years ago, because I think that the nature of IT is still the same, which is when you get into heavy functional accounting software, not every company is going to have somebody who is really a SME for that, or even fully understands it beyond the SQL database. And so I think a lot of clients are relying on consulting to do those upgrades. And there's a big difference between having to do that once a year, versus every 6 months versus every 2 years. And then you layer on top of that, people have a lot of other initiatives that they want to put in place. And what I think we saw was, especially at the smaller end of the mid-market, people kind of weighing, I want to implement a paperless invoice solution versus the need to upgrade, because I could do one or the other, but I can't do both. or I need to space them out, right? And the longer release schedule definitely allows people to kind of take on some of that system enhancement without having to constantly be on the hook for the next upgrade.
And I think that's a good point that actually Jason alluded to, is what is the value proposition for each new release of GP, and how has that changed over the years? I recall that in several years ago, it would be that, wow, GP 2013 has these significant enhancements to the core functionality that would really, say, motivate an AP department to want to upgrade. And it seems the more rapid releases tended to have smaller enhancements, and they may not have had the same value proposition. So why would a customer really need to upgrade to 2015 R2? Is there really a big push for that, or can they just wait for one or two more major releases?
Unless they have payroll. And that's where you get into a dynamic that sometimes is frustrating for the customer, right? Because with payroll, you're kind of kept on a hook, and you have to stay current, and you have to be able to get that year-end update,
Good point.
I think it was also killing ISVs who were trying to certify a release in parallel in tandem with every GP release, and I think those 6 month, that 6 month cadence or semi-annual was killing some of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. It often takes ISVs a couple months to get comfortable with the latest release and recompile and test and do all that. Yep.
Yeah. One of the points you touched on there, something that's been on my mind, and I hope to dive into it more myself, is this idea of, if the costs can be brought down on things like upgrades, or on things like, other things too, maybe not related to upgrades, but things like cloud infrastructure, or I don't know, other things that are sort of bringing the cost of ownership down. Are companies, in fact, willing to then invest those dollars in things that they've always been I think this is almost exactly what you said, Christina, but things that they've always been lacking in. So whether it be training, which no one ever spends enough on, right? Or, building all the reports they really need, or maybe something else. Do you think that actually could kind of shake out of this kind of a change over some amount of time? Do you think companies will really see that opportunity for what it is?
I would hope so. I feel like any kind of, maybe aside from the upgrade, but any kind of market downturn tends to manifest itself in a higher level of, how should I put it, engagement, I think. Like, I've started to kind of challenge mentally the premise of training, right? That because I say that, I'm like, people always skimp on training, they always skimp on testing, Mm-hmm. But, the more years I do this, the more I think where people really skimp is on engagement, on taking responsibility for the system internally to understand it. And I, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong in your experience, but in my experience, people that are happiest with the software, the people that are getting the greatest ROI on the software, are companies that have engaged in the day-to-day with the software heavily and have shifted their relationship with consulting to be primarily strategic. So I'm not calling a consultant every time I need little things fixed, but I'm calling the consultant when I want to sit down and talk about how we go paperless, or how we streamline the onboarding of a new company, or, so that's where I'm spending my dollars. And I'm not spending my dollars on maintaining a system. And I think we see that shift. I hope that the upgrade being spaced out more allows more room for that shift to happen. But I also feel like that happens in leaner time naturally, because they don't want to spend money on, how do I do a recurring journal entry when I could look it up myself? Or, how do I fix this problem when I could fix it myself, or our IT could fix it myself? I want to save that money for what I consider to be strategic initiatives that can benefit the company's mission. And I know for me, like, those are the engagements and the relationships that I gravitate towards now, more so than, the day-to-day.
I totally agree on the customer engagement point. The most frustrating projects are those where I'm unable to identify a clear project manager or team leader on the client side, and where I have to manage the project for them. It is independent of hours or income or revenue, it's not what I want to be doing. I'd rather have the client drive the process and I assist them. It makes the project smoother. It increases satisfaction. And at the end of the day, I can walk away and they can be happy instead of having, them constantly relying on me for very basic things. So I agree with that. And in terms of the expense of the professional services and the software and anything related to an upgrade, it has me thinking of Dynamics 365 and the SaaS model, right? So in theory, if you're using, say, Dynamics 365, you don't necessarily have the same concept or concern around upgrade costs that you do with an on-premise solution. Now, there are cloud solutions, like maybe you use one of the cloud providers for GP and it's fully hosted and you don't have to worry about that. So that's coming to GP through that manner. But it's something I'm thinking about, is like how are things going to change in terms of cost ratios and how customers think about what an expense is related to their ERP system if it's just a subscription and then they have separate consulting services. How is that going to change the market?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you mentioned 365 for financials, because I know you wrote quite a bit about your experiences, Steve, so far with learning it, right? You went through a 4-day training. Yep. So it sounds like it was pretty in-depth. You documented a lot of what you learned, what you discovered. Could you maybe summarize a little bit about what that experience has been like, and maybe what you're actually doing with the financials solution?
Sure. I started to look at Dynamics 365 for financials, now apparently being rebranded as Dynamics 365 Business Edition, I believe. And,
Finance and Operations Business Edition.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what the current name du jour is, but I looked at it. I tried to play with it, thinking, I'll just poke around and figure it out. But I just didn't have the focus to spend enough time to tackle that learning curve. And so I finally, in speaking with another consultant, said, well, let me just attend the training that was organized by, I believe it's Liberty Grove Software. Mm-hmm. And they hired a trainer, a team of trainers to assist with the training. It's actually 2 full weeks of training on 2 different sessions a month apart. Very intense. And the core functionality is Dynamics NAV. So I believe that a Dynamics NAV consultant would recognize much of the functionality. But because they're migrating that functionality to the Microsoft online platform and presumably in Azure and making it web accessible, there are some functionality differences and some limits to the functionality, but it looks like a neat product. Definitely took me the training. I had to take the training in order to fully wrap my brain around how it worked. Very different concepts than what I'm used to with GP. Just completely different mindset around the design of the system, the user interfaces, how users interact with it. And because it's different than NAV, there aren't necessarily ways to talk about how the system works or the functionality, despite some similarities. So interesting product. I think the price point of something like $40 per user per month is very compelling. My question is, if customers are paying that amount, are they going to balk at the professional services that I believe are going to be required to properly and fully implement that for the upper mid-market customers?
Right. I could. So it's something you've really just been educated on. You haven't worked with it with any companies yet.
Correct. I haven't implemented it, and my focus with GP has been very much on customizations and integrations and outside of the core implementation market. And so I'm looking at Dynamics 365 for financials / Business Edition in the same way. How do I enhance that product to add value? I don't know that I want to be involved with financial reporting on 365. I don't necessarily want to help customers configure their fixed asset depreciation or document or help them with their payables transactions. What I'd rather focus on is how can I use my background in development and ERP and accounting to figure out how to offer additional services. And one interesting twist is I have a colleague in Australia that I work with, and Australia has a new government-sponsored program that helps vendors and customers transact with each other through their government-designed payment platform. And so many of the ERP systems in Australia are looking to connect to that platform. So one opportunity is, okay, great, since Dynamics 365 is web-based, it's hosted in Azure, how do we use that API to interact with the Australian EDI platform to help transact for Australian customers? And it's a very different conversation than what I'd be having for Dynamics GP. And I think the combination of development skills and ERP skills and knowledge of the product could make that happen and greatly enhance 365.
Yeah, coming soon to AppSource.
Yeah, exactly.
Steve hits on a really good point with regards to all of that, is that, I think there's been some consternation at different points regarding Dynamics 365 and where it fits with regards to GP. But from my perspective, I know Steve and I have corresponded on this as well, that, there's just a natural evolution in technology, right? And I think one of the really important things that Dynamics 365 does is get us to a mid-market solution that is fully cloud-enabled. It opens the door for a lot of subscription-based services, which is something that a lot of GP partners, it's not something that people have gotten into previously because there wasn't really a strong market demand for it. But I kind of welcome it because I think that it's something that customers want. And I think, it's a trend that is inevitable, and the nature of what we do ever changing, right?
Yeah, and I recall there was a lot of consternation and hand-wringing and resistance among some people in the Dynamics GP community when the concept of Madeira and 365 was announced for the mid-market. And I understand that because it's going to be a dramatic change for those partners who have invested sometimes decades of their careers into this one product and the Microsoft ecosystem around it. But the world isn't standing still, and Microsoft as a company, they're having to look at their competitors, Intact, Acumatica, and most prominently for me is NetSuite. I've seen what NetSuite can do. I've implemented it. I've customized it. And you just open a browser tab and you're there. And you write a little JavaScript and you've customized the system, and updates occur seamlessly. You get an email a couple weeks in advance, and it completely changes the mindset around what is ERP. And Microsoft, I think, is trying to catch up to that model. And it totally makes sense. They need to compete in the marketplace. So this is their solution, and I don't blame them for moving in that direction. And that's change, and I'm happy to have it. That makes me more competitive if I can learn it. Allows me to offer more value to customers. So, at
the training you were at, or other places, have you seen other GP focused people taking an interest in being kind of open-minded about learning what the 365 Financials is all about?
Absolutely. And Christina, you attended the first week of training as well. But I know Rod O'Connor with Bryware Solutions, he's been very open to 365, and he did a kind of a trial implementation of his own company, his own financials in 365. So he's been leading the way on that, and he's written several blog posts about that. And Christina and I were in the training, and another partner I met at another training session. She's down in San Diego. She was in the training as well and was very eager to learn 365.
Yeah, we have a gentleman here that's in our Colorado office that, went to a 2-week deep dive on Navision at Microsoft's recommendation, and that room was full of GP partners. I think any partner who's not is going to be challenged when they're asked the questions from the client. So even if they don't want to take it on in terms of selling it, I think to Steve's point, there's a lesson in being educated. I mean, there's definitely a qualifier for that, in terms of what is going to be the best fit for a client. Where I work, we do AX as well. So it kind of was a natural for us to dig deeper into 365 because of the operations end. And then, of course, you want to kind of span as far as you can down to the small, mid-sized business. But I think most partners are doing the homework, either to make sure that they're, positioning GP the way they want to in order to be successful, or because they're considering taking it on to kind of cover the gamut. So,
well, I think consultants can offer different types of value, and although we know Dynamics GP, we have deep knowledge of the product, how it works, and we can offer value there. I think a consultant can also offer value across multiple platforms. So I don't want to be tied forever to Dynamics GP. So to the extent I offer knowledge around SQL Server, Visual Studio, software development, integrations, Smart Connect, you name it, all of those things produce a more valuable set of skills for my customers. So if I can come up to speed on 365, that's just another product in my set of knowledge that I can offer to a customer. So for me, it's not a huge deal. It's something that, I've adapted to because Microsoft has made announcements. We knew it was coming. So it's just a natural transition to a new product.
I think to that point, Steve, I think that is also the differentiator for consulting partners, right? I mean, the software knowledge is not the hard part. Yep. To be, in my opinion, I mean, you can study for that, you can go for classes for that, you can, practice for that. I think the hard part is all the other skills that surround that, right? And all the in terms of requirements and delivery and project management. And those, I think, are, for most partners, the competitive advantages, right? Where that lands, and I think from a product perspective, the more you can have in your stable in terms of getting people into the right software, I think the more competitive you can be.
And related to the blog post that I wrote about 365, my focus with writing those blog posts was to see how I could compare GP to Dynamics 365 financials in order to kind of understand the mindset and the differences between the two products. That helped me learn. It's like, 365 Financials /NAV handles transactions in this manner. It's a different philosophy. It's a different design from the back-end system all the way up through the user interface. And it really challenges some of the design assumptions that exist in GP, where maybe you can access distributions for transactions directly and change GL accounts. Well, in NAV, you get to ask that question, is that a good idea? Should we allow that, or should we let the system handle those low-level tasks that are often error-prone or where a typo can cause problems with financial reconciliation? So it was really educational to know and see more than one system. I think that really rounds out your perspective to know that just because this system does it this way, there may be alternative ways of thinking about and implementing your system.
All right. Well, I think we can end it there. Are there is there anything going on that you want to just give a mention to today? Any upcoming projects or writing you're doing or events or anything else you wanted to call attention to?
There is the GP Tech Conference, which is the latest rebranding of the Fargo event. When is that? Is that in August, Christina?
Yeah.
Okay, so
August.
Yeah. That's in August in Fargo, and I believe that's a partner-only event. And then I've submitted several session ideas for the GPUG Summit, which is going to be in Nashville this year.
All right, great.
I'm looking forward to Nashville. Nashville will be fun.
I've never been there, so I'm excited to go.
Yeah, likewise. It's like one of those cities I'm a little surprised I haven't made a point of going there at some point, because it's such a iconic place, right?
Well, we will get everybody out line dancing, right? At some point.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, slow down. Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Christina, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Great.
This has been the MSDW Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to get in contact with us, you can reach me by email, jgumpert@msdynamicsworld.com. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World signing off.
Get on my side, there's a hole